we're going to be on. It's going to be all the questions that I sent you.
Yeah. And good questions, all good questions. Yeah.
I hope so.
There's Paul.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for being here. Get going in just a second. We will invite you to turn off your cameras at the start, or you can keep them on if you like, but we will be spotlighting for the stream and recording the camera onto our speakers here today.
Okay.
Yep. All right, here we are. Bonjour et bienvenue tout le monde. On behalf of all of us behind the scenes here at For Space, welcome all to One Love Literary, a conversation that I'll let the organizer tell you more about in just a minute. But first, thanks for joining us in person or online. We are so happy to welcome you to Concordia University's For Space, located on unceded indigenous lands in Tiohtià:ke, Montreal. At For Space, we work to connect people to the initiatives, research projects, and dialogues happening across the university via daily events. So we're so pleased to welcome in this conversation. We are recording it and live streaming this event, and we will be spotlighting the speakers. So even if you turn your camera on, that's okay. You won't show up in the recording until the very end if you want to jump in with a question. I'll pop also the link to the live stream into the chat in just a second. So like I say, there will be time for questions in the last 15 minutes, so feel free at that point to turn on your video, raise a hand, or the chat is activated for you throughout if you like. With that, it's my great pleasure to pass it over to Olga Tsygankova. Over to you.
Hello, everyone. I hope my microphone is working. No? Is it working now? Yes. Okay, great. Hello, everyone, and welcome to One Love Literary, where we try to stop people from burning books. I am your Ukrainian lover of English literature, also a Concordia master's student, and today I am super excited and honored to be talking about all things literary and his one love in literature to one of my favorite people at Concordia, Dr. Manish Sharma. Dr. Sharma, welcome.
Thank you so much, Olga.
And I will just give a very short introduction to Dr. Sharma. Dr. Manish Sharma is an associate professor in the English department at Concordia. He researches Old and Middle English literature with a particular interest in medieval philosophy and logic. He is the co-editor of Old English Literature and the Old Testament, and the author of The Logic of Love in the Canterbury Tales, which we're going to be talking a lot today. Both books published with the University of Toronto Press. His current research project focuses on secular and Christian representations of love in Thomas Malory's Mort d'Arthur. Oh my God, Mort d'Arthur, that's right. Immense. Yes. That's huge. So, Dr. Sharma, I'm very grateful for your presence here and for the ability to have this conversation with you. I know that you've been working on your book, The Logic of Love in the Canterbury Tales, for a very long time. And the book is being published by Toronto University Press in July,
yes,
right?
That's right, yeah.
Yeah, this is great. And before we go into the fascinating content of your research, could we start by introducing one more person who is also invisibly present with us in this room today? And maybe not everyone is as familiar with him as you are, and a little bit I am. And I think it's very symbolic that we're talking about him on the first day of April, because the prologue to the Canterbury Tales famously starts with April, right?
Yes, that's right.
So could you please introduce Geoffrey Chaucer to us and just give us a Chaucer checkmate in three. Kind of just three facts three moves that would give us Geoffrey Chaucer.
Wow, three. I would say that Chaucer is one of the preeminent European writers of the late 14th century. His writings are deeply influenced by French, Italian, Latin, and English sources. And his works also receive the impress quite profoundly, but in rather oblique ways, of the tumultuous events of the mid to late 14th century, including the arrival of the Black Plague, the 100 Years' War against France, the political instability during the reign of Richard II, and the Peasants' Revolt of 1381. That's more than 3 points, perhaps, but it gives you a sense of the context within which Chaucer is operating.
Yes, I'm thinking if it's a checkmate, or I still can get out of it.
Just a check, yes.
But it's definitely a confident check. Okay, great. So I'm going to start from afar. Everybody knows about the crisis of the humanities. And the humanities, especially literature, is a very unpractical field. It's difficult to argue that it is applied to any kind of real world matters or issues. And I think literary scholars are in the Red Book right now. And maybe they were already in the Red Book when you were choosing the profession. And so could you tell us a little bit of why you chose this profession, and do you remember of any particular moment when this happened?
That's an excellent question, one that is difficult to answer. I suppose the best answer is that I had phenomenal teachers of literature, and those inflected, the trajectory of my career. My first teacher of medieval literature just recently retired from McGill University, Dorothy Ann Bray. She taught me Old English literature. She's a profound scholar, a wonderful, humane, generous teacher. And we keep in touch, she continues to influence the way I think about literature. I had the privilege also at the University of Toronto to be taught Chaucer by E. Ruth Harvey, who really brought it to life for me when I was an MA student in the English program there. And Roberta Frank as well, who's now at Yale University, but was at Toronto while I was there, and she taught me Old English literature. So I just saw what these wonderful scholars, the way they spoke about literature with such passion, but with such acuity and knowledge and profundity. And I thought, well, this is something that I would like to do as well, just to have access to literature in a way that's not just, about getting pleasure from the text, but also interrogating it with rigor, with discipline, with these powerful conceptual tools that these other scholars bring to bear.
That's amazing. And did you experience any pushback from your family?
Oh, yes.
When you announced?
Yes. Well, my parents were more practical minded than I was and am, I suppose. They were a little bit concerned that their eldest son wouldn't be able to support himself or a family, and indeed I was concerned as well. So after 2 years on the job market, I thought, well, maybe there isn't a huge market for a scholar of Old English poetry out there, and I should enroll in law school, which I did actually.
You did?
But I continued to write and I continued to publish, and was very fortunate to be granted an interview with Concordia's English department, and even more fortunate to be offered a job, and that was an extremely happy moment for me. I think law school is wonderful, but it's a totally different approach to language.
Did you finish it?
It was before the end of my first year that I was offered the job at Concordia.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So, as much as I enjoyed it, and I had wonderful professors at the University of Toronto Law School, but I knew where my heart was, where my love was. Yeah.
Yes, yeah. I did the same. I went to law school.
Oh, you did?
Yes.
Okay, right.
So here we are.
Yes. Well, they're trying to close a text down, right? They're trying to close a text down, while in this field we try to pull on a thread and open it up. Yeah.
That's much more interesting, for sure, and creative.
Yes.
Yeah. And did you have any moment when you doubted your profession when you?
Oh yeah, that happens all the time. I think
still?
There's English professors in the audience, and for them as well. You're always questioning your choices. It's a demanding field. You want to remain productive. You want to keep reading. You want to keep thinking. But it's difficult. It's difficult to keep that hunger, to learn new things, because you can't stop. You can't stop, otherwise your scholarship will just be tepid and bland and uninteresting. So it's a demanding field, but it also means that you're a life learner. You're constantly
that's a part of this.
You're constantly exposed to new ideas and new conceptual paradigms, and that's what makes it really exciting. So there's always doubt. There's always times when you hit a brick wall with an idea that you had previously cherished, and that's frustrating. But as long as you keep reading and writing, you get over those walls. Yeah.
Oh, that's very inspiring for me to hear that. Okay, so I understand that your primary interest was in Old English literature.
Yes. Yeah.
So Beowulf.
Yeah, that's where I started. I started as an Old English scholar, but then I jumped over the gap of the Norman Conquest into the Middle English period. Well, when I came to Concordia, the department asked me to teach the full year Chaucer course, and I did that for the first year, and I did that in many succeeding years as well. So I've taught that full year Chaucer course 10 or 12 times, I think. And there's always a danger when you teach Chaucer, over the years, you fall in love. So a few years ago, it was after about a year after the birth of my first child, I was thinking of what to write next. I thought, well, I've been reading Chaucer and Chaucerian scholarship for, a decade now. Why don't I write something about Chaucer? So that essay which was published in the Chaucer Review, turned into the seed of a larger book project. So that essay came out in 2017. So I started working on the book in around 2018, 2019. And it's kind of bookended by the birth of my first child and the birth of my second. So in that intervening space, I was at work on this.
But that love was forced on you.
What's that?
That love was forced.
In a way, yeah, it was. It felt inevitable, I guess. To read Troilus and Cressida, to read, the Canterbury Tales over and over again, and to just be exposed to their tremendous sophistication, humanity, generosity, and philosophical rigor as well. It was kind of shocking to see what a medieval poet could do. Not to say that Old English poetry has fallen off the radar for me. I continue to think about, read, and I hope write about. I hope to write more about Old English poetry. But there was something about Chaucer that really attracted me. So I'm glad that affection has resulted in a monograph.
Yeah. So Chaucer, is he a social satirist, a religious authority, or a writer who went astray? In your book, you quote Jeffrey Allen Hirschberg, who says, "That is the task of a poet as a rhetorician, to create by words, which must necessarily refer to the corporeal world, images of a higher, indeed of an eternal truth." And you also argue that it is impossible to pin Chaucer down as a moralist poet. Could you comment on that? Do you think that?
Yeah. That's a great question. Hirschberg is approaching the Canterbury Tales as a kind of Neoplatonic text, right? You move from the particular to the universal. You move from, the world as a moving image of eternity to the eternal ideas that structure, that govern that world. So is that what Chaucer is after there? If he is, then he's a didactic moralist, right? He's encouraging us to locate some sort of universal truth or truths, in his text, and that is the function of much medieval literature, didactic literature, is that some sort of sententious moral will be expressed by a literary work. And in that way, literature, which always has sort of a vexed relationship to the truth, vexed relationship to morality, is somehow controlled. Its danger is diffused. Right? At the other extreme, you have texts that are just written for pleasure, right? And texts only written for pleasure are not contained by any sort of moralistic authorial intent. So, this as informed scholarly responses to the Canterbury Tales. Is this sequence of tales ultimately moralistic? Is it attempting to teach us something? And then Hirschberg's comment is accurate. Or is it playful? Is it playful? Is it,
so there's a tension.
Exactly. Is it just inviting audience responses? Is it just open to the vagaries of audience reception? These are the two poles. So, what I argue in the book is that neither position, I think, accurately reflects what Chaucer is after here. Right? And I guess the paradigmatic expression or instance of that tension occurs at the end of one of Chaucer's most famous tales, the Nun's Priest's Tale, which is, as you know, Olga, is a tale about two chickens debating philosophy, debating dream theory, debating predestination and free will, right? And at the conclusion to this tale, the Nun's priest, the author of the tale himself, guides us as to how to interpret it, and that's what an author is supposed to do, right? It's supposed to provide some sort of moral whereby the audience can be instructed, right? And so he says, look, audience, take the fruit and leave the chaff. So he sort of abdicates his authorial responsibility and says, no, it's up to you, audience, to read this tale as you see fit. So that suggests then that the Canterbury Tales collectively may be open. It's up to us to read it and glean what lesson that we may, or just read it for pleasure without any sort of authorial containment or authorial control. However, what's interesting about that statement, take the fruit and leave the chaff, is that it's an imperative, and it's a command. So what is the nun's priest doing at the conclusion to this tale? He's commanding us to be free. Well, if you're commanded to be free, are you free or are you controlled? Are you disciplined, right, by the author? We can't quite decide, right? We can't quite decide. So is the Nun's Priest's Tale, and by extension the Canterbury Tales, open to the vagaries of audience reception, or is it contained, controlled, authorized by a kind of God figure, right? The author himself? That question is technically undecidable, right?
But the author is definitely not separating the fruit from the chaff for the reader.
No, but he's commanding us to do so. So, if we do read the Nun's Priest's Tale with unpredictable license, we're still obeying the author. So we're free and not free at the same time.
At the same time.
And that's, I think, a kind of a critical element of the structure of the Canterbury Tales, is this sort of paradoxical relationship between necessity and freedom, order and chaos. Right? The Nun's Priest's Tale is neither well-ordered nor is it chaotic. It's something else entirely. And so it's intriguing that within the Nun's Priest's Tale there should be this extensive digression on predestination and free will. And that's a really important debate in the Middle Ages. Right? God as omnipotent and omniscient creator of us all. If he's omnipotent and omniscient, does that mean that there's any freedom for human beings? Or is our conduct already sort of predicted in advance, designed in advance, right? Is the world already kind of predetermined? Or do we have some sort of free will? Well, Chaucer confuses that question with this final utterance of the Nun's Priest, right? We can't quite decide between necessity or predestination and free will. Right?
And you interpret that undecidability as the logic of love.
Yeah.
So,
that's right.
But love seems to belong to the emotional realm.
Yes.
And logic seems to belong to the rational realm.
Yes.
So how do you see those two?
Yeah, that's a great question. Logic and love really fit uneasily together. And in order to make the articulation of these two concepts more compelling, you have to make an appeal to Scripture. You have to make an appeal to Christ's Sermon on the Mount, which, in fact, one of Chaucer's pilgrims does cite. And he cites a particular passage that I think is particularly important for our understanding of how love is operating in the Canterbury Tales, right? So Christ says, "Judge not, lest ye be judged." Don't judge. That's what love means for Christ. It means the absence of judgment. And maybe that's what Chaucer means by love as well, right? You love when you don't decide. You love when you don't decide between necessity and free will, between order and chaos. So the missing link there, or you know, that which chains logic to love, is the absence of judgment, right? This undecidable statement is the paradigmatic expression of love for Chaucer because it involves the absence of decision or the absence of judgment. You don't decide between two mutually exclusive alternatives. And that's what love is for Chaucer, not deciding between two mutually exclusive alternatives.
And is that a special kind of love? Is that love equal to what's called charity, or is it a broader idea of love?
That's a great question, because charity is perhaps one of the most important concepts, theological concepts in the Middle Ages. And the ultimate expression of charity is you know, Christ's redemptive incarnation, right? God himself takes on human form in order to, you know, live in the world, suffer in the world for us, die in the world for us, according to Christian theology, right? And that is, you know, that is kind of a fundamental expression of charity, of God's love for humankind. So what does it mean, you know, for Christ to abdicate, you know, his status as supreme governor, supreme authority, right, and become one of us, someone who is without authority, right? That, I guess, dynamic or that gesture is, again, another way to nuance our understanding of what Chaucer is doing in the Canterbury Tales, because Chaucer himself does the same thing. Right? He does exactly what Christ does. You know?
Yeah,
Chaucer is the God author of the Canterbury Tales, right? But you know, he injects himself into his own narrative. Right?
Yes.
So the authority is at once without authority.
Yeah, so you argue in the book that Chaucer's position in relation to the other pilgrims is akin to a medieval insolubilia, an unsolvable problem, right? Yeah. So can you explain how that works?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Chaucer says something really interesting in, well, Chaucer the Pilgrim says something really interesting in the general prologue to the Canterbury Tales. Right? He says, you know what, I'm just going to recount what my fellow pilgrims, you know, spoke about, the tales they told on this pilgrimage. You know, I'm going to be their amanuensis, right? Just a neutral recorder of their words. I'm going to be at their service, right? And that's a really odd position for an author to take, right? So he's not going to be the author. He's going to abdicate his authority. But then he says, you know what I'm doing here has precedent, and it has precedent in, you know, in the words of Christ, and it has precedent in the words of Plato, right? So what exactly is happening here? You know, he's abdicating his authority, but he's authorizing his abdication of authority by appeal to the arch-philosopher Plato and God himself, Christ. So this is, I think, a semantic paradox, right? Chaucer is authoritatively abdicating his authority. So he is at once the supreme authority, the author of the Canterbury Tales, and devoid of authority, just another character who's just recounting what his fellow pilgrims are talking about. And this is another way to understand what Chaucer means by love. Chaucer means by love the authoritative abdication of authority, right?
Wow.
You know? So when you love someone, right, you're neither a master over that person, over the beloved, nor do you sort of cut that person free,
loose,
right? Yeah. So the authoritative abdication of authority means there's some sort of insoluble entanglement of mastery and freedom, authority and the absence of authority. And that's, I think, how Chaucer understands Christ's incarnation, as a paradox. And, you know,
so Christ is both man and God.
And God, the supreme authority, and someone who's devoid of authority, someone who can be treated as a slave, right? Someone who can be executed, right, as a criminal, right?
So is Chaucer imitating
I think so.
Christ
I
in
think
that
so.
way?
I think so. And that's one way we can kind of understand why Chaucer is humiliated when he tells his own tale, right?
Yes.
You know, and it's always understood as a moment of high comedy in the Canterbury Tales when the author himself, you know, is invited to tell a tale by the host, Harry Bailey, and tells an incompetent tale, and he's not even allowed to finish it.
I will just make a very short introduction of that moment, just in case some of us are not familiar with it, is that Chaucer actually tries to tell a story. At the beginning, the host looks at him and says, "What man are you?"
Yes.
Basically, who are you?
Yeah.
And then as he tells the Sir Topas tale,
Yes.
he is interrupted mid-sentence, and the host tells him to stop because his poetry is not good enough.
Yeah, he says it's not worth a turd. Right?
It's not worth a turd.
Yeah. Can you imagine an author humiliating himself in that way? That's what he's doing, but that's exactly what Christ does. Now, why does it happen in the tale of Sir Topas? Well, the tale of Sir Topas, and I know one of your questions will deal with this, so I'll wait for to expand upon this point. But the tale of Sir Topas,
we can talk about this now. Yeah,
it follows directly after the Prioress's tale, right? And the Prioress's tale is perhaps the most controversial of the Canterbury Tales because of its caustically anti-Semitic, anti-Judaic content, right? The Prioress is, clearly, inarguably, an anti-Semite, right? And so, particularly after World War II, Chaucerians were deeply troubled by this anti-Semitic content in the Canterbury Tales, right? Why should we be studying this work? What are the ethics involved in teaching and researching Chaucer? Do the Prioress's views reflect Chaucer's own views, right? And these are questions that have animated Chaucerian scholarship for generations, for decades, right? And it's a really important question to ask.
Yes. Well, yeah, we're gonna talk about the Prioress a little bit, but let's go back to Sir Topas.
Yes.
So how do you think this interruption works in the narrative? What does it tell us about Chaucer as an authority in the text? And then he goes on to tell a tale in prose, right? So he abdicates his right to.
Yeah. Well, I understand the self-humiliation, the self-abasement of Chaucer in the tale of Sir Topas as an analog of Christ's own humiliation, self-humiliation, right? And therefore as a profoundly loving gesture. And this allows me to put pressure on the two basic ways that the Prioress's tale has been understood in Chaucerian criticism. It's either been understood as one, a reflection of Chaucer's own anti-Semitism. He's a product of, of an age where that is an acceptable position to hold, or two, Chaucer is just satirizing, criticizing, mocking the Prioress. I propose a third alternative, right? Christ's incarnation, Christ's redemption of humankind is a response to our sinfulness, right? And that seems to be what Chaucer is doing in the tale of Sir Topas. He's not mocking the Prioress, nor is he merely reflecting her poisonous anti-Semitic views. He is loving her and therefore forgiving her. And that, I think, is Chaucer's comportment to all of his fellow pilgrims. And in fact, this allows me to reinterrogate the nature of the general prologue itself, because the general prologue has always confused scholars because of its lack of moral judgment. The general prologue, as Jill Mann in the 1970s argued, is what's called an estate satire, right? And an estate satire is a cross-section of medieval society, which examines the particular estates or jobs, like parson, miller, reeve, knight, prioress, etc., in order to see whether or not a given representative of that estate lives up to the ideal. And when they don't live up to the ideal, they are targeted for moral castigation. But there's no castigation in the general prologue. So it's an estate satire without the most important ingredient, this sort of critical attitude towards those pilgrims or those representatives of estates that don't live up to the ideal. But Chaucer does not judge his fellow pilgrims, no matter how depraved. Even the pardoner, who's generally understood to be the most depraved of Chaucer's pilgrims, does not come in for judgment, for obloquy, for castigation, right? Chaucer avoids judgment. And that's why undecidability, I think, can be profitably and productively associated with love. Chaucer in the general prologue, and this has widely been acknowledged, is non-judgmental. Non-judgmental. And all that means is that he loves his fellow pilgrims. Right?
But the Prioress is, so the Prioress is one of the most controversial and difficult pilgrims, because she's so overtly anti-Semitic.
Yes.
And in the general prologue, she is described as a very high religious figure. And then there's a phrase there that she lets no morsel fall from her lips, which does have an ominous quality to it. It seems to comment on her tidiness.
Yes.
But it does seem to have a little bit of a kind of strike a little bit of an ominous note.
Yeah, I agree. The Prioress places an absolute premium on cleanliness, right? And her tale is, also just privileges the clean over the dirty, right? The portrait of the Prioress in the general prologue emphasizes that priority, right? She's very concerned with the rules of courtly conduct, the rules of polite conduct, right? So she won't let even a morsel drop from her lips. She's got great table manners, right? Very clean table manners. Ironically, the description of her table manners is borrowed from the Romance of the Rose, a famous French allegorical text which deeply influenced Chaucer. But in that text, the description of table manners is put in the mouth of an old prostitute, right?
Oh,
so,
wow.
right. So the
that
clean,
complicates things.
The clean and the unclean are always entangled for Chaucer. And in fact, for Chaucer, love means not deciding between the clean and the unclean, right? For the lover, the beloved is neither clean nor dirty, right? Neither spirit nor sheer carnality, right? But the Prioress is different. The Prioress decides, right? The Prioress decides for the clean and rejects the dirty, right? In fact,
so she's a judgmental pilgrim.
Yes, exactly. And I think we can divide the pilgrims into those two camps. There are pilgrims who judge, there are pilgrims who decide, and there are pilgrims such as the nun's priest who refuse to judge, who refuse to decide. And that's why the structure of the insoluble, the structure of these undecidable statements goes to the heart of what Chaucer is about, Chaucer is trying to do in the Canterbury Tales. And I think that one of the fundamental lessons of the Canterbury Tales is that the lover does not decide on love. The lover does not decide on love. And it was kind of a revelation to me when I was reading the general prologue, when I was writing my chapter on it. There's this really famous description of this piece of jewelry that the Prioress wears, right? And she's not supposed to be wearing jewelry. That is strictly forbidden. So she's breaking the rules here, right? And inscribed on this elegant piece of jewelry is the following, Latin tag borrowed from Virgil's Eclogues: "Amor vincit omnia." Love conquers all. Love conquers all. That tells us everything we need to know about the Prioress, and it tells us everything we need to know about Chaucer's attitude towards the Prioress. Chaucer's fundamental lesson in the Canterbury Tales is that the lover does not decide on love, right? And what is love? Love is this undecidable entanglement of mastery and freedom, authority and the absence of authority. While the Prioress, as that piece of jewelry, that inscription on the piece of jewelry indicates, absolutely does decide on love. Love for the Prioress is mastery, conquest.
Yeah.
Amor vincit. Love conquers. It never frees. And that comportment towards love is reflected in her tale. So this gives me a way to say, well, there's no, there's no way we can understand Chaucer as merely blindly reflecting the anti-Semitism of the Prioress, right? Instead, he's taking a much more nuanced attitude towards it, a nuanced posture towards it. The Prioress is not a lover. Right? The Prioress is not a lover because she decides on love. But Chaucer is still capable of forgiving that,
Yeah. So you are saying that we should not associate Chaucer with the Prioress and not...
No, I don't think so. Yeah, that would be my position. Absolutely. Yeah.
Has it been argued otherwise?
Well, there are two main camps. One camp associates Chaucer with the Prioress. The other one says he's critical. He's satirizing the Prioress. I don't think he's doing either.
So it's undecidable.
Well, he's loving her. Yeah. Yeah.
And why? So you're arguing basically that he's redeeming her through Sir Topa's tale.
I don't know if he's redeeming her. I would say that he is, I mean, the fact that he's forgiving her means that she's done something that needs forgiveness,
sure.
right? You know, so that's his attitude towards all of his fellow pilgrims, right? As revealed by the general prologue, no matter how depraved they are, and the pardoner is a pretty bad one, right? The pardoner is someone who puts the souls of those who listen to his sermons at, you know, in dire risk. He's still capable of loving him, you know. So, you know, it's a way to kind of think about the, I guess, the power and the infinite expanse of charity. Right?
So this love is not about redemption as much as acceptance and forgiveness.
I think so. I think so. I mean, yeah. I wouldn't just say acceptance. You know, you don't just get off scot-free when you love someone. You know, if love is the undecidable entanglement of mastery and freedom, then you know you can neither say that the person that you are forgiving is free, but neither can you say that the person is sort of crushed into the historicity of the act, the wrong act, the failing. Right? Loving someone means existing in this delicate, undecidable suspension between these two attitudes, and that's a very difficult posture to maintain. Right? So love doesn't mean just getting off scot-free. It doesn't. You know? Yeah.
So you are basing it on the idea of liar's paradox.
Yes.
And yeah, I did Google liar's paradox.
Oh, good.
There were following popular searches there: how to solve liar's paradox, and am I a pathological liar? So my question is, the liar's paradox, or Cretan paradox is also known, is attributed to a Cretan prophet who said all Cretans are liars.
Yes.
This is true. If this is true, it is false.
Yes.
If it is false, it is true.
That's right.
Right?
Yeah.
So can it be solved? And can this paradoxical relationship in the Canterbury Tales be solved? And should we even aim at solving it? Because see, like the people who search Google, they always want to solve the liar's paradox. So there's always this desire or longing to resolve this insoluble problem.
Yes.
Can we solve it? Should we try to solve it?
The medievals believed it could be solved, right? And there are some absolutely ingenious, stunningly elegant formulations that in fact generate some very persuasive solutions to the liar paradox. And in fact, a contemporary logician and philosopher at the University of St. Andrews, Professor Stephen Reed, argues that a medieval solution should be championed today by logicians because it provides the most persuasive solution to the liar's paradox. And this solution was composed by Bishop Thomas Bradwardine, who's a near contemporary of Chaucer, and Chaucer mentions him in The Nun's Priest's Tale. Right? And Bradwardine provides a really elegant solution to the liar's paradox. Now, I mean, any solution can still be, tested. It doesn't have to be, it's still controversial, but it's rather persuasive. But whether it provides some sort of final solution to the liar's paradox is still, I think, an open question. Now, I think Chaucer is influenced by medieval considerations of the liar's paradox, but I think he invents his own paradox, which is the authoritative abdication of authority.
Oh, so it's an invention.
Yeah, I think it's an invention. Yeah. Now, the liar paradox and similar paradoxes were part of your university education. If you were an undergraduate at Oxford or Cambridge or Paris, this was one way to kind of refine your intellect, to struggle with these paradoxes. So it's no surprise that authors who are educated in the university milieu should import their considerations of paradox into literature. Of course, Chaucer is not university educated. He's an autodidact. I mean, he's a passionate reader of literature and logic, but he doesn't come out of that university milieu. And that may be one explanation for the difference between Chaucer's approach to paradox and those, and those who are more embedded in that university context, right? For Chaucer, love means refusing to insist on a solution, right? And I think that goes to the heart of the ways that the Canterbury Tales have been read. Either we decide that the Canterbury Tales have some sort of final moral, some sort of virtuous lesson that they're going to teach us, or, as is the more common modern tendency, we say, no, it's open, it's interpretively open, right? Mm-hmm. But my argument in the logic of love is that both of these approaches to the Canterbury Tales, to say that one, it is closed, morally closed, and two, that it is just pleasurably open for audience reception or infinite readings, these are both decisions, these are both solutions. So the only way to understand the Canterbury Tales is to love Chaucer, which means to refuse to decide on these two alternatives. Is it authoritatively closed, or is it non-authoritatively open? And that, again, is to mirror the structure, for Chaucer at least, of the incarnation itself, whereby Christ is at once the supreme authority, God himself, and devoid of authority, just an ordinary human being suffering along with the rest of us.
I wasn't planning this question, but I wonder, the Chaucer makes a retraction at the end of the Canterbury Tales, and he kind of renounces his frivolous tales. Yeah. And when he renounces them, he enumerates his frivolous tales. Yes. But he did not destroy them in any way. Mm-hmm. He just enumerated them, attracting even more attention to them in that way. Yes. So what is he doing in this retraction?
That's a great question. That's a great question. And the retraction has received immense amount of attention from Chaucerian scholars, because it seems to be the author's final word, right? On his text, on his literary creation, on his literary composition. So maybe the mystery is going to be resolved here. And sure enough, Chaucer says flat out, I renounce my vain works, but I hope that God will keep in mind my virtuous works. So he seems to be making a judgment here, right? I separate the clean from the dirty, the good from the bad, the virtuous from the vain, right? But then there's one line in the retraction which scholars have puzzled over. He cites St. Paul from Paul's letter to the Romans, chapter 15, verse 4, which is also at the end of the Nun's Priest Tale. He says, all that is written for our instruction, and then he ends the quote, and that is my intent. Okay, that's a really interesting line, and I believe, and I wish, I argue in the book that it expresses the same kind of undecidable logic. All that is written for our doctrine, our instruction. That means you, reader, interpret my works as you see fit, right? And then the quotation ends and Chaucer's voice returns and he says, and that is my intent. Mm-hmm. It is my intent that you disregard my intent, right? That's a paradox. So we have two ways of reading the retraction. One, we say Chaucer is judgmentally separating the virtuous from the vain, or two, Chaucer is loving all of his works. Now, what I think the retraction is an invitation to the reader to love Chaucer, to forgive Chaucer. And how do we do that? We don't decide on love, right? We refuse to decide either on the judgmental Chaucer, Father Chaucer, right? The God Chaucer, or Chaucer the lover, Christ Chaucer, the Chaucer who embeds himself in his own narrative and views his fellow pilgrims in the most charitable and forgiving way possible. So if you want to love Chaucer, and if you want to understand the Canterbury Tales, you can't decide whether Chaucer is judgmental or non-judgmental. And maybe that's, what Chaucer is positing in the retraction is a way to love God as well. You don't judge whether God himself is judge or lover.
Wow, that's amazing.
And just like in the liar paradox, truth and falsity are entangled. At the end of the Canterbury Tales in the retraction, love and what love excludes, the opposite of love, judgment, are entangled. Right? So the retraction...
So judgment is included.
Yes, it's entangled with love.
Entangled.
Yeah. So if we're to love Chaucer, right, we cannot judge between judgment and love.
Wow. That's where it gets too complicated for me. But I guess this is going to be our last question if we have questions from the audience. But I wondered, because as I was studying Chaucer with you, I read a lot of Chaucerian scholarship, and a lot of it was very judgmental. Critics judge pilgrims. Sometimes they judge them very harshly. They call them fallible, depraved, deviant, etc. Especially, of course, the arguably queer pardoner and the wife of Bath. How do you see that criticism? Because I was very surprised. I thought Chaucer is such a kind of lighthearted or inviting, this humorous attitude to his texts, but there is such serious attacking posture very often assumed by the Chaucerian critics.
Yeah, I mean, the Canterbury Tales have non-serious tales, and they have very, very serious tales as well. I mean, the Parson's Tale is very serious, right? It's a tract on salvation, on penitence, you know, how to get to heaven. The Second Nun's Tale is very serious. It's a passion of a saint, right? The Vita of a saint. But there's also, yes, humorous tales as well, tales that are just pleasurable to read, like the Miller's Tale. That also, you know, I think contains some sort of serious element, but you know, that's another discussion. I mean, what do literary critics do, right? Criticism derives from, you know, a Greek root krinine, which means to judge, to decide, right? In order to be a literary critic, that means you have to take some sort of position. You have to be decisive where a literary text under analysis is concerned, and that's why reading the Canterbury Tales has in my view, proven so challenging. It's because Chaucer is encouraging us to adopt an uncritical posture, right? A forgiving posture, a charitable posture. So in order to read the Canterbury Tales, you can't be a literary critic. You can't be, right? You have to read it uncritically, which means not deciding, not judging between two mutually exclusive alternatives. And we see with particular force and clarity at the conclusion to the Wife of Bath's tale how this in fact operates, right? I mean, the Wife of Bath's tale concludes with this scene of loving reconciliation between a husband and a wife, right? Where both submit to each other, right? It provides an instance of mutual and loving reciprocity. But then there's this epilogue to the Wife of Bath's tale, which directly contradicts that conclusion. And it's a harshly judgmental epilogue. The Wife of Bath says, you know, give me good husbands who are meek, submissive, young, and sexy, right? And curse those bad husbands who are old and miserly.
And let them die as soon as possible.
Yeah, exactly. Christ kill them as soon as possible, or something like that, right? Yeah, so we have harsh judgment in the epilogue, but loving reconciliation at the end of the tale. And a lot of ink has been spilled in trying to synthesize these two positions. How do we make sense of that? Well, the typical way, or the standard reading of the end of the Wife of Bath's tale, to say, well, you know, the Wife of Bath is serious in her epilogue and playful in her tale. That's just fairy tale. It doesn't really count. Yeah, that's a decision. That is a decision. This is true, this is false, this is the good reading, this is the bad reading, right? The alternative, of course, is to love the Wife of Bath. And how do we love the Wife of Bath? We do not decide whether she is loving or judgmental. And that's why the key to understanding Chaucer's Retraction is contained in the conclusion to the Wife of Bath's tale. The Wife of Bath's tale is Chaucer's most virtuosic teacher of love. And that's how she teaches us how to read the Canterbury Tales itself. You don't choose, you don't decide between love and judgment. That's the only way you can understand the Retraction, and the only way you can decide, the only way you can understand the Canterbury Tales.
Wow, I think that has taught me a lot about love and judgment, and definitely the Canterbury Tales.
Good, I'm glad.
Let's see if we have some time to take questions from the audience. Let's see, so if you're in Zoom or if you're live and you would like to pose a question, please raise your hand in Zoom and I will call for you to speak. Let me see if there are questions in the chat. No, there are no questions in the chat.
There's a question here.
Okay, great.
Hi.
Matthew.
Hi. Thank you for the talk. It's been wonderful. Sorry. So considering the premise of the talk, Olga, you had said that humanities and literature are sort of in the red book, and for years people have been doubting how applicable it is to our day-to-day life. And Dr. Sharma, you had talked a lot about Chaucer's view of love. I was wondering if in your research for the book and in your personal scholarship, discovering Chaucer's view of love, if that has affected your own view of love in your personal life, how it would apply to your day-to-day life, and how would that sort of redeem the state of English literature for us today, 700 years after Chaucer's direct audience? How would that affect us today, and how has that affected you?
That's a great question.
Yeah,
I think.
that's a big question and a great question. Yeah, I mean, it just, I think we all know that, at some level, that love means the absence of judgment. When you judge, you place yourself, upon a superior vantage, and you look down at the person who is somehow failing, according to a standard you have imposed, or a standard that is collectively imposed. And that's just what you do on Twitter. That's just what you do in the chat boxes. And that's what you just do in the comment section, right, on every article. Is you just try to one up your ideological opponent, right? And that process just goes on and on and on, and it will never end. And it will never end, right? But maybe the opposite of that position, or the more enriching, the more humane position, is to move from judgment to the absence of judgment, and that doesn't mean some kind of synthesis. What is really striking about the Canterbury Tales is that it entangles two perspectives that are radically opposed, and that is the Christian and the secular. What happens at the beginning of the Franklin's Tale is that we have one character expressing a Christian prayer, or articulating a Christian prayer, and we have another character articulating a very pagan prayer, right? And we can't quite decide whether the Franklin's Tale is set in a Christian universe or a pagan secular universe. These two positions are somehow entangled. Chaucer, and this is why I don't think Chaucer is a Christian. Right? Christianity means excluding that which is non-Christian. For Chaucer, what charity means, what Christ means, is entangling what is otherwise excluded. So the Christian and the secular are somehow entangled, right? Not synthesized, but entangled, in the same way that truth and falsity are entangled in the liar paradox. So I think this gives us some kind of interesting and productive resources in terms of thinking about the opponent, the ideological opponent, So there's, you can either hammer away at the opponent until the opponent is defeated, or you're defeated, right? Or you can try to find some middle ground between these two positions. Or perhaps you can find some way to be entangled with this opposite position, which excludes your own point of view. Is paradox a way to assume or to conceive of a non-judgmental posture? Is there an ethical valence to paradox? So it's another way to think about love in a way that may have contemporary relevance. But I'm not writing this book, to say, well, this is the answer or anything like that. I'm intrigued, by the fact that we live, intrigued and occasionally horrified by the fact that we live in a very decisive world, right? A hyper-decisive world. Those we elect as leaders are always decisive, right? Judgmental. Right? Otherwise, we don't elect them. We don't elect them. Right? Is there an alternative to judgment? Is there an alternative to decision? That's what the Canterbury Tales are about. Right? Is that at least? Yeah. Okay.
Great. Thank you very much. Okay. Do we have any more questions? Question in the audience? Yes, please.
Thank you. I don't know if this is on. The question is, the question. The question is actually what you just said sort of leads me to believe that actually you're talking at once about love in a theological sense, but you're also talking about play and ludicness, or the ludic, such that the ludic is one way out of the liar's paradox, insofar as if you're playing, you can do anything to a certain extent. So I guess my question is there a, where does play fit into this particular theological argument, but also the literary argument, and finally the philosophical argument that seems behind both of them?
That's a great question. So there are two criteria for the host of the Canterbury pilgrimage as far as the quality of tales are concerned, right? He says, look, the person who tells, or the pilgrim who tells the tale, which has the most sentence or morality and the most solace, pleasure, playfulness, that's the one who's going to win this competition and get a free meal and lodging on all of our expense when we return back to London, right? And the Tabard Inn, where of which Harry Bailey is the proprietor. So there's what is serious and there's what is non-serious, right? What is playful, what is ludic, as you say, right? The serious text, as we were discussing when the podcast opened, has some sort of moral, right? The non-serious text, the playful text, does not, right? So this is a question that Chaucer is posing. Am I composing something that is, am I creating something that is serious and sententious, or am I creating something that is non-serious and playful? A larger question, because Chaucer is, of course, the author of the Canterbury Tales, a larger question is the following, and this may be the most fundamental question that the Canterbury Tales poses. Is God himself playful? Does God play, right? Or is God just serious, right? Is God a very, very, very serious individual? If God is a very serious individual, there's nothing gratuitous in the universe. Everything is preordained and everything is predestined, right? I think in the same way that Chaucer refuses to decide between the sententious and the playful, this also sort of constitutes, or this also gives us a way to understand the way he thinks about God, right? We can't quite decide whether God is a very serious individual or whether God plays, right? We don't know for sure, but there are elements in the universe that are gratuitous, that are playful, that are open to our interpretation, that have no final meaning, that have no final purpose, right? So in this way, Chaucer places himself at odds with Boethius, for instance. Boethius.
We haven't talked about Boethius.
Boethius in his Consolation of Philosophy, a philosophical text that's hugely influential in the Middle Ages, and one that Chaucer translates as well. Boethius posits a God who is a proponent of order, right? For Boethius, the universe is well ordered, right? Chaucer understands God in a different way. Chaucer understands God as an entity who may just play, although we can't be quite sure, right? So that I think is how play is inserted into theology, right? Charity, love, does not decisively exclude play. Rather, what is serious and what is playful are entangled, though not synthesized. Does that make sense? Okay, thanks, John.
Thank you. I don't know if we have time for one more short question. Yes, then you.
Both of you. I don't know if this is short, but I'll phrase this this way: and it's actually coming off of your last statement. Sure. Is how can we propose, or how can we conceive of Chaucer's theory of love, the one that you advance in your book? What are the sources of this? I mean, because there seems to me, based on what you've said, is part of it is based on his autodidacticism, on his, and it's true, right? Yes. The French influences, the Italian influences, Ovid and so forth. Mm-hmm. But we also know that he lived quite a rich life as a clerk, being well-traveled, working for the government.
Diplomat, soldier, yes.
Getting into some accusations that were unsavory for his time as well.
Absolutely.
So what is the relationship, I guess, at its basic, this is my question, what is the relationship between his literary study and also between his life in informing this kind of unique concept of love that is sort of theological, but not really?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's tough to say, it's tough to draw a straight line from Chaucer's complicated, messy life to his intellectual accomplishments, right? I mean, if we're going to try to locate the sources of this theory, this conception of charity in the Canterbury Tales, in the book, I argue it comes from exactly three sources, right? It comes from, first of all, his acquaintance with medieval insolubilia-literature, right? Second, it comes from Christology, right? And this notion of God, of Christ himself as this paradoxical entity who is both, infinite and finite, creator and created, supreme authority and devoid of authority. And third, it comes from this really interesting and important antinomy between two really, strongly articulated and influential philosophical positions in the medieval period, and that is one realism and the other nominalism, right? So the realist position is basically the Platonist position. There are these eternal ideas, and the world is just a copy of these eternal ideas. So the ultimate authority and reality rests with, the realm of forms. And for a Christian Platonist, those ideas, those forms are within the mind of God. Now, the nominalist position, championed most famously perhaps by the Englishman, William of Ockham, is that eternal ideas, eternal forms do not exist. There are only material particulars, right? So there have been arguments that Chaucer is a realist, and in fact, quite recent ones. There was a book published in 2019 arguing that Chaucer is a Neoplatonist. And there have been arguments as well that Chaucer is a nominalist. He doesn't insist upon eternally existing extramental ideas, forms that serve as exemplars for everything that exists, right? So, is there the authority of the forms, right? Is everything that exists just a copy of these ideas in God's mind? Or is there no such authority, right? Is there no such ultimate eternal exemplar for what exists? I think this is one way. Chaucer refuses to decide between these two alternatives, right? And he understands that absence of decision through the nature of Christ's incarnation. So the authoritative abdication of authority can be indexed or can be refined or nuanced by understanding these two philosophical positions. Either there is formal authority or there is no formal authority, right? And these two positions are entangled, linked by his consideration of insolubilia. So he understands Christ as an insoluble, right? And he understands the relationship between nominalism and realism through this notion of insolubilia. So we have the overlapping, the intersection of three domains. Christology, how is Christ understood in the medieval period? How is the philosophical antinomy between realism and nominalism understood in the medieval period? And finally, the influence of insolubilia-literature on Chaucer, which allows him to connect these domains, right? So if it comes from anywhere, I think it comes from this overlap between these three really important spheres of thought. And what's interesting is that the Canterbury Tales have been understood in terms of each one of these domains, right? Each one. Christology, absolutely. You think of D.W. Robertson Jr. Insolubilia, absolutely. Peter Travis has written a book about the Nun's Priest Tale as a kind of insoluble. And finally, the opposition of realism and nominalism, philosophical readings of Chaucer abound. So what the logic of love tries to do is say, look, these three domains have to be thought together. And that's the only way we can understand where Chaucer's notion of love comes from. It comes from Christ, it comes from insolubles, and it comes from the relationship between nominalism and realism.
I think that's a great way to sum up and to give this conclusion to our conversation today.
Thanks.
Thank you very much for this question. So I would like to really thank Dr. Sharma for coming in today and having this amazing, very interesting conversation.
My pleasure.
With me and with all of us here. I would also like to thank ForSpace at Concordia for generously providing their facilities to make the literary conversation accessible to everyone. Thank you all very, very much.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Olga.
Thank you.
Thanks all. Thanks you so much for coming.
Indeed, and thank you, Olga, for the behind-the-scenes organization making this happen. I think I'll just echo, there's some great comments in the chat. People are inspired to revisit or discover Chaucer, so job well done.
Great.
Good. Please read Chaucer, yes.
And I think we're going to have, I think,
you can pre-order Dr. Sharma's book.
there you go.
Yeah, it's a very affordable $95.
Olga, I know we had said that this live event was going to be turned into a 20-minute podcast by the Fourth Space team, but I'm not sure how we're going to have our work cut out for us because there's really not much we might want to cut from this conversation.
Yes,
it was so
exactly.
great. Anyhow, folks, we will be closing up the Zoom now. So thank you so much for joining us. And those of you in the space, once again, our gratitude for your presence here with us to create a bit of community. So thanks, everybody. Have a wonderful weekend. Enjoy April. We hope to see you soon. Bye.
Bye, thank you.
Everyone.